Hello, Penn State fans. Happy Wednesday, May 7th, and for many of you, happy day after another spring transfer portal commitment for Penn State. A lot of you like to celebrate Victory Sunday back during the fall. Well, now you get to celebrate Victory Wednesday in the spring. That's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickle from Blue White Illustrated. We had you covered on Tuesday night when Penn State picked up North Carolina linebacker Omari Campbell out of the transfer portal. We're going to spend a lot of time, not the whole show, talking about what he brings to Penn State. We have some other transfer portal stuff to get to, and some thoughts on how this Penn State team is constructed now that presumably Campbell is the last addition we didn't previously plan for. I'm talking, of course, the rest of the 2025 class that's going to come here in the next couple of weeks. So we're going to get into that as well and close things out with some more talk about what we learned from the Blue-White game. T. Frank, it was a weird week last week with all the power issues that you and many other people had in State College. It's good to be back with you here on a Wednesday.
Yeah, I missed this show last week. We're going to be talking about the Blue-White game to end things because I didn't get a chance to just word vomit about what I saw during the Blue-White game. So we'll be saving that for the end of the show. But yeah, missing those last couple of days last week was a real bummer. Glad we're back this week. Glad everything's fine. This is all particle board. I don't have any wood to knock on. But anyway, happy to be here. Happy to have you back on the show and get back into the swing of things. And of course, if something happens at 8 o'clock, or 8:30 on a night where we have a show at 10 a.m. the next day, it's best just to save that conversation for here on the live show so we're not, saying the same thing twice within 12 hours, basically.
Yes, well, we'll have plenty to say on that here coming up in a set. Good morning to all of you I see in the chat. To those of you listening on replay, thanks for being here with us. Don't forget, no matter how you're watching today's show and all of the shows here on the Blue White Illustrated YouTube page and also on our podcast feeds, don't forget to like, subscribe, leave us feedback, leave your questions. You never know when the mailbag is going to open up and we may need something to get to. Fortunately, not the case today because, well, maybe later in the show, but at least not right now because as we said to start things off, a new commitment in for Penn State. The second spring transfer portal commitment, Omari Campbell, a Virginia native, played 2 seasons at North Carolina, very productive statistically a year ago, did not redshirt as a true freshman. T-Frey, interesting offseason for him. He hit the portal when there was the coaching change initially at North Carolina, decided to come back, give Bill Belichick and his staff the spring, went through spring ball, and then hit the portal April 22nd. Oddly enough, same day that Tamir Robinson committed to USC. And so he's been on a little bit of a search for his next school since. Visited SMU, according to On3's Pete Nakos. We don't know if there are any other trips, none reported at least, by On3 or anybody else. And then on Tuesday night, after a visit to Penn State, he decides to join the Nittany Lions. So interesting player, interesting tape. Let's start with your initial thoughts on just why Penn State was interested in him and then what he could bring to the table.
Yeah, I'm all over the place on Omari Campbell.
It seems like most of the internet is. That's the vibe I'm getting as I look not just at the Lions Den message board over at Blue White Illustrated, but also social media. It seems like
fascinating player.
Yes, right.
Yeah, he's kind of a contradiction. He's either 6'1" or 5'11", depending on where you look. He's not overly tall, but he's stocky, and he played Mike linebacker for North Carolina last year. He also was a Mike linebacker at that size, so a little bit undersized, not the classic thumper, but a guy that moves well in space. I think he's a guy that's athletic, but not a sideline-to-sideline guy despite his size. There's plays where he just does not get out into the flat when he's chasing somebody down, quarterbacks and things like that. But I'd say you'd label him a good athlete. And then you have to factor in kind of he's young. Second, he's a redshirt freshman, I assume, at that point last year. Starting at Mike linebacker, making the calls, making the direction for that UNC defense. And so that's a mental load. And he struggled with it, I'd say, generally in terms of his post-snap play. But he also was lining up the defense. And I don't know whether he was correct or not in all of those things. So it's just there's a lot I'm still filtering through. I was expecting the linebacker conversation maybe to play out a little bit longer with Mohamed Toure still out there making this leap and going, I'm still working through some of my thoughts and some of the film on Amare Campbell. But the biggest thing that I had in terms of what I didn't like about Amare Campbell that I felt like was maybe kind of a deal breaker for me was the fact that he was not physical at contact. He was not going through blocks. He was not taking on offensive linemen correctly, and he was giving up ground, but not even in a way that was kind of an athletic way. He was just kind of avoiding contact. And so I rewound to the beginning of the season. And so I started the season with a cast on his hand. So that explains that. By the end of the season, then I flipped ahead to some of the games that, week 12, things like that, and much more physical, much more aggressive and confident coming downhill and taking on blocks. So at least I feel better about that. There's an explanation. There's some context for that. But it's really what you weigh in terms of upside and development versus what you saw on film. If you are going to say what he is from last year is what he will be for Penn State, then he's fine. He's a guy that's going to come in and be a part of the rotation. But if you project upside, you say that's a guy who, as a sophomore or as a second-year player, showed a lot of promise, and you would expect mental development from there. It's May 7th, though. How much time he has to digest the defense and play is going to be really interesting, and I think that's going to inform where he fits into the defense, whether at that Mike linebacker position where he played last year or at will. And I think I still have a feeling that's up in the air. That conversation, what they need, the youth and the balance of that room right now does not feel settled to me. And I think that's something that in training camp in August, they're going to have to sort out.
Campbell finished last year with 76 tackles for North Carolina, 10.5 for loss, 6.5 sacks. As you mentioned, depending on what part of the season tape you watch, you can draw all sorts of different conclusions. And the internet is doing that. You're going to have a pretty, I would assume, I don't want to put you on the spot. I'm going to guess you're going to have a film room at some point on him over at bluewhiteillustrated.com or something like it anyway.
Absolutely have to. Yeah, right. Have to for sure. And that's coming today. I was watching some stuff this morning and a little bit, probably last week when they first set up the visit. So I have a pretty good read of what he is. And if you're looking for a guy that's going to fix the problem in terms of fix the problem being a star linebacker, that if you don't trust Tony Rojas because of his injury last year, or if you think Dom DeLuca isn't the athlete that Penn State needs, Omari Campbell's not fixing any of those problems for you. But he can be a number 3 linebacker that works his way into, a 1A or 1B role for this team, providing stable linebacker play. And one of the things that I think is important, and we're going to talk about this later when we talk about the blue-white game and why it's so important to understand this defense and how it's fundamentally different despite being similar to everything they've done before. The linebackers are not going to be the star of this defense. They haven't been the star of the defense for Jim Knowles, I think, ever. He likes to use either D-line or secondary players as kind of those players he's designing a defense around. So, do you need to have a guy that is an Abdul Carter, Micah Parsons level player? Maybe not in this defense. And so, I think he's good and he can be a fit in what they're looking for, but everyone wants the surest possible thing. And I think if you were looking at Mohamed Toure and there's a little bit more explosiveness, there's a little more physicality, there's a little more size, a little more violence, you probably are disappointed in Omari Campbell. But I don't want to dismiss the upside there is of growth and development from a guy like that.
I think it's important to note, too, and you did a few minutes ago, but this is not necessarily typical for Penn State in the sense that most of the transfer guys they get are older guys who have maybe a year left, in some cases 2. He's going to come here with 3 years to play 2. Of course, you wouldn't expect him to redshirt at any point, barring injury. But he has, 2 seasons in front of him, and he's already done some productive things. Yeah. And you hope, if you're Penn State, that he can provide you with depth. And again, this conversation we talk about, is he a depth guy? Is he a starter? Well, let's see what he gets here. Let's see what he brings to the table once Jim Knowles, Dan Connor, the Penn State strength staff get their hands on them. I mean, I think back to some of the conversations we've had throughout the spring, and then we'll have a little bit later in the show about some of the guys who were either transfers or younger guys. We're going to talk about one of those transfer possibilities later, but that maybe at the start of spring ball, you didn't think or didn't hear their name as much, and you really weren't expecting them to pop out at all during spring practice. And boom, here we are. And the potential for them to be a maybe bigger contributor than we thought in 2025 in the fall is a possibility. And I think they got to keep that in mind with Campbell as well. Yes, he did not not have a spring practice at Penn State, but he did have a spring practice, which is good. The spring transfer portal window is interesting forever. It always has been. It always probably will be, because you have guys that, I think most would agree, your main high impact guys transfer in the fall, but not all of them. And I think Campbell can fill a role. And I think if he fills a role where he is a part, at worst, part of the rotation and on all four special teams, at least for this year, I think Penn State will be very happy with that. So time will tell. Yeah. But I agree with you. I get the sense that it's just a very interesting dynamic reading the internet this morning as we talk on May 7th at about 10:10 in the morning, is that some people seem to be really excited about this and maybe too excited. Some seem to be way more disappointed than I can really fathom. And I think, as always, the middle ground to start is probably the place to be.
It's also so this I agree, and that's that. It's better to have a strong opinion on the internet because then that's where people are gravitating towards. But there's a lot of nuance in a player's production and a player's abilities. What I'm interested in is how he fits in the Penn State defense, and this. Let me explain the situation I'm trying to work through here, or the point I'm trying to get to. I'll just get right to it. Penn State doesn't have any Mike linebackers right now that I feel like you can be confident are going to fill that role. And also, I'm trying to work out the evolution of that position based on what I'm getting from the program in terms of Matthew Lama is an old school, big physical Mike linebacker that doesn't have the explosiveness and sideline to sideline range of a modern linebacker. And yet when I watched this defense in the blue-white game, they had Anthony Specca lining up wide outside of the tackle box. And a lot of the things that structurally in this defense that I've been talking about all offseason, it kind of pushes those box linebackers out into space more often. So what do they want from that Mike linebacker position? And who's playing there? Dom DeLuca played Will. And Anthony Specca played all the reps at Mike linebacker for the blue team during the blue-white game. So to me, that tells me Tony Rojas is the Mike linebacker. And they're trying to get those young guys ready to spell him at that position with the idea that Keon Wiley and Dom DeLuca would be the two at that Will position. I don't know how any of that works right now. Like, I'm not convinced of that plan. And I think part of the reason they're bringing in a guy like Amare Campbell that has that probably position versatility of being a good enough athlete, put him in the boundary. He can blitz. We see, the production in the sack production, but also somebody who's operated the defense before. What is the plan for him, and how does all of that kind of work together? Where are you trying to put your best pieces in this defense? It is different under Jim Knowles, and that's something that I'm trying to understand and work through my traditional understanding of how they like to have these guys, and then the evolution with what they're trying to do this year. And I think there's some flexibility there, but in my mind, the best possible thing to do is keep Tony Rojas at the will linebacker, which is traditionally where all those playmakers make plays. The will linebacker is where you put the Abdul Carter. It's not a guy that's playing a lot of Mike linebacker, the guy that's commanding the defense in the middle. So that's something you got to continue to work on, but they found a guy that can fit both. And I kind of walked a really wide path to come back to we'll see, but I just think that if he can play Mike, which would be hard, then you have that traditional setup, if that's indeed what they want.
Yes, and we'll see what exactly Jim Knowles and his Penn State defense wants as the year progresses. But Penn State exited the spring. James Franklin was adamant and direct at his final news conference following the blue-white game that if you're a linebacker out there and you want to play for Penn State, they have room potentially, and they go and get a guy. So Penn State had a need it felt like it had to address after Tamir Robinson left. At this point, addresses it with Omari Campbell, and we'll see where, if anything else happens with Penn State in the portal from there. As we talk again at 10:15 on May 7th, Mohamed Toure, no decision made, was going to take some other visits. I think it's easy to just sit here and say that, Campbell committing when he did and Toure taking other visits, but ends where, Penn State was at in the portal pursuit process, but you never know. So we'll wait and see how all of that plays out.
And we'll always have to Carbon wants them both. Yeah, we got somebody in the chat saying if PSU is smart, they'll go get Toure despite the injury situation. I think they'd love to have, because here's the thing. Now you've got a conversation where you got four players, and you can say those young guys we don't have to worry. Like, we can let them develop in the background, because I think Anthony Speck is going to be a good linebacker. I still have some concerns about and honestly, Omari Campbell has the same issues. He's just a year older in terms of biting on play actions and RPOs. That's the biggest issue he had in terms of reading the defense. And Specca, watching him in the blue-white game, he is so instinctive at coming downhill and attacking gaps and things like that in the run game. But I feel like he's still that guy from high school that just wants to hit people and just wants to run the football. You love that, but you need to control that a little bit more. And I think he's still working through some of that. I know they love what they got in him. I know they love what he did in the spring. But if you're saying, like, we need to get through the hardest games of the year and we need enough guys, if you got 2 in the portal, now there's no questions, because Toure and Campbell and DeLuca and Rojas, you can do whatever you want with that group. I just think that would be unbelievably hard to get all those guys on the roster.
Right. And, of course, Penn State and the rest of the college sports world still waiting to see how the House versus NCAA case and the pending potential settlement of that plays out as it relates to where roster limits are going to go or not go for 2025 and beyond. And that there may be news on that today. Today is the deadline for the parties in that case to give the result of their mediation, I guess you could say, to the judge. So we'll see what we learn about that. It seems like that stuff comes out later in the afternoon. Usually, I believe it's because the case is being decided in a court on the West Coast. So stay tuned for that. We'll have more news about that at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com and on 3 as the news happens. Again, I'm not expecting a decision today, but I would expect we get some info from the court filings today. So we'll see how that all plays out. But speaking of roster limits and roster positions and things of that nature, with Omari Campbell, now a Penn State signee, he did sign per On 3's Pete Nakos. Penn State has, in all likelihood, probably finished up its spring portal work. Again, Torrey's still out there. We'll see how that plays out. But I think we're, inching ever closer, T. Frank, to the end of the transfer portal changes that Penn State is gonna have this year. So I want to take the conversation there next and look at where Penn State is and is not. Now that the transfer portal window, of course, for the spring closed last week, but guys who are in the portal still have as much time as they want it to make a decision and decide where they want it to go. And, obviously we just saw Campbell do that on Tuesday night. Other guys are still taking visits. And so things are still happening. But in terms of entries, for the most part, those are done. Grad transfer guys, of course, can still find a way in there if desired. But all told, T. Frank, we're going to get into, I guess we'll start with the guys who Penn State picked up in the portal we'll get to that momentarily. But from the 50,000-foot level, it definitely felt like a different portal cycles for Penn State than what we've seen in the past.
It's weird because there's the part of the portal cycle that happened during the playoff. So
it almost feels like it didn't happen, right? But it did.
Yeah. And so, like, there are names that went in. And it almost felt like the post-season portal was Penn State's transfer portal window, but that's not true. Like, got Jerry Cross and Bo Perbule that went in early in the year. And, it's when you look at the names all together, it's quite a long list, right? So you got the T.A. Cunninghams of the world and the Bo Perbulas, but then, you look at the guys that happened recently in J.B. Nelson, Tamir Robinson, John Mitchell. So it's quite the list out. Did you have a number of this? I know the number in is 8, but is it 14 or 15 on the way out? Something like that?
Because one name I forgot to put on this list, and we didn't have space for it appears anyway. But let's not forget that Smith Vilbert hit the intermediate portal window.
That's the one that felt like that started the portal. Yes. That felt like the first window, and that's just the intermediate window.
Yeah, correct. So he ended up, of course, at UNC under Bill Belichick. So some UNC trading for Penn State and the Tar Heels this offseason, with 2 defensive linemen leaving the Nittany Lions to go to Chapel Hill, and Campbell coming to Penn State, of course, out of the Tar Heels program. But yeah, I guess overall, T. Frank, you look at the in and out, and it was a little bit busier on the outside of things than it has been in past years, but nothing crazy. Nothing that was overly concerning, I didn't think. Obviously, the biggest surprise, to me anyway, on that list was Vilbert, just because he said he was coming back and then bounced. But then obviously Tamir Robinson leaving in the spring, I did not see that coming at all. I mean, the USC depth chart, again, is very barren when it comes to inside linebackers. So I understand if he felt like he wasn't going to get the playing time he wanted at Penn State, why that would be appealing. But if you look at that list again, and for those of you watching on YouTube, I'll flash it up here again of the guys out. None of the names on that list truly shock me or surprise me. I mean, Cam Miller going to Rutgers, maybe a little bit, but we know what that cornerback depth chart is like. JB Nelson, a guy that was going to be a swing guy, very good swing guy. If he felt like he could be a full-time starter without question somewhere else, you understand that move. John Mitchell, again, it's kind of the same cornerback application that we just had with Cam Miller, but definitely Robinson, the biggest one to me. That if I look at that list, if I was putting together a list, and yes, we did, in case you were wondering, even though we don't like to talk about it publicly, of guys during the first portal window that could leave, and then guys who might want to move on after spring practice, I wouldn't have had Tamir Robinson on either one of them.
It's interesting, again, going back to the discussion, because we can talk about linebacker, and we can just say linebacker, and then we don't have the context of there are two starting spots, and how does the roster view you? How does the staff view you? And then where are you within that pecking order? So if he were at Mike linebacker, because that's where they had him last year, was at Mike linebacker more often when he was with Anthony Specca. And now Specca moves over to that Mike position. And if he feels like he's behind Specca and Tony Rojas is the starter there, we know that those guys, whoever it is, he's not going to be one of the starters. So now if he's maybe the third linebacker and you want that playing time and you want to get on the field to develop and make your mistakes and, develop your confidence and have all those things happen for you, that does make sense. But that would be something we didn't expect, because I think at the beginning of the season, at the beginning of the spring season, we expected Tony Rojas to be that will linebacker and stay where he was. I'm going off of the fact that Dom DeLuca played 9 snaps in the blue-white game, and some of the things I saw during practice didn't totally add up to they made the switch we were expecting. So there's so much TBD, but the putting the strings together on the board to get all the clues, that feels to me like the reason why, if you're Tamir Robinson, you would decide you want to leave, because you don't feel like you're the clear number 2. And you're behind a guy in a class who you thought you were going to be playing next to and with. And now you're clearly behind him, and Tony Rojas is not coming off the field this year. So generally the overall snaps in the path to the field feels like there was a block there for him, more than just the competition of where he was in that roster battle for number 2.
Right. So that wraps up the outgoing portion of our Penn State portal recap. In terms of the in, obviously you all know the names by this point. Devontae Ross and Kyron Hudson come from Troy and USC this winter. King Mack returns. Owen Wafel transfers in from Michigan. Anai White and TJ Shanahan come from Texas A&M. And then obviously our spring additions that we've talked about, Omari Campbell from UNC and Traber Pena from Syracuse. It goes without saying, we talk about this almost every single show. We'll talk about it again on this one. Penn State wanted to reshape its receivers room. It did that in both windows now, with some guys in, some guys out. And I guess my big takeaway is, if you're in the same boat with me, and I might be hopefully the president of this fan club, but that I'm not buying anything with this receivers group until I see it, and preferably see it against Oregon, not the 3 non-conference games, though you're going to have to see something, of course, then to give you any confidence you'll see it against Oregon. But you cannot give a single ounce of doubt or negativity or what have you to James Franklin, to Marcus Hagans, Andy Kolnicki, Mark Dupuis, who's an analyst that works with the receivers, all of those guys, and the rest of the recruiting staff and offense staff, they knew they had a weakness. Everyone saw it in the college football playoff semifinal. And for better or worse, we won't know the answer to better or worse T. Frank for quite some time, but they went out and tried to fix it. And whether or not they made the right decisions to fix it, we're just going to have to wait and see. You can't fault them, though, for the way they went about trying to at least shake things up, bring in some new faces, and try and revamp this receivers room to a place that Penn State and its fans want it to be.
Yeah, and that's why I don't want people to just out of hand dismiss. So, you're right to say we'll believe it when we see it. But when you finally do something different, and I would say that they're doing the same thing with the linebacker room of James Franklin is very protective of the culture, is what he's said multiple times. I want to make sure that the guys we have in the locker room are the guys that we're prioritizing. But if you're in 2025 and you're going for a national championship run, and it's clear that they are, everyone's feelings are now secondary. And so the receiver room, everyone's got to get over it. And the fact that they brought in Trevor Pena after spring football makes that abundantly clear. And the fact that James Franklin was aggressively going after linebackers, and I think they would probably add another guy in Torrey, which everyone in chat wants them to do. Yeah, I think they would love to have that happen. But will a guy with 1 year left of eligibility gamble of maybe he's the third linebacker or the fourth linebacker, which I doubt, but those are all the things that they're trying to do. And so if you don't acknowledge a change in the process, then you're going to miss the seeds of what does actually eventually change the narrative about the receiver room specifically, which ultimately happens with recruiting. And those young guys have to either get into the program or develop as the freshman or redshirt freshman right now. But they absolutely brought in a different mentality when you talk about Trevor Pena and you talk about Kyron Hudson. Those two guys are definitely what Marcus Hagan's talked about when he talked about, from what I've seen on film of those guys, they are, I hate using this term, alpha mentality receivers, where when the ball is in the air, they believe that the only person entitled to that football is them. And they will go up and they will fight for it, literally and figuratively. And you got to like that, even if a guy like Pena is smaller than you expected, and maybe he's not as strong as you'd like. But that mentality in jump ball situations matters as much as your size and your wingspan, because not everyone is going to have the same mentality when the ball is in the air. That's just one thing that I've learned watching football over the last couple of, over the years, is you can make up for a lot with your desire, but you have to have enough of the athletic threshold for it to matter. And these guys do have that. They're just not overflowing with that ability on the top end.
Right. And all told, I think Penn State, position to position, incoming, outgoing, fine portal cycle, address some needs, maybe had some guys leave you didn't expect, but by and large, I don't see any of the departures being ones that you look back on this fall. I mean, maybe one or two end up this way. We'll see, but especially if injuries would pop up. But I don't see looking back and saying this guy, that guy would have made a huge difference. And we'll see if the incoming guys, obviously they were brought here to make an impact some way, some shape, some form, some quicker than others. And whether those guys can do that, we'll have to wait and see. But a fine portal cycle for Penn State.
You got 6 of those 8 that you could expect reasonably to make a contribution this year. Obviously 3 receivers I would expect to start. And then you've got King Mack, who I would expect to, if not start as the slot safety, then be a key contributor, one of the 4 players that rotates in at safety. And then we got a couple guys that are right on the bubble that I think that had strong springs. And I really like what they bring to the table. Could play their way into a role on the team. That's really good for if you're trying to maximize your transfer portal, maybe not with names, but guys who can be solid contributors and can raise the floor so that your superstars can be superstars. I think they nailed it. I think they've nailed what they needed in the portal this year. Whether or not the individual players live up to that is, nobody knows that. Not the players, not the coaches, not us.
Right. And again, that's the beauty of the offseason, is that we'll have to wait and see exactly how this all plays out in the fall. But I think if you're a Penn State fan, or if you're Penn State and you leave this portion of the offseason, you should be pretty happy. You should have been happy with the winter window, and you should be happy with the spring window as well. So time will tell how this all plays out, but we will continue to discuss it en route to the 2025 college football season, which, of course, will be here before we know it. This is the BWI Live Show for Wednesday, May 7th. That's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickle, going into the second half of today's show. First half, unexpectedly, transfer portal heavy. Second half, we're going to turn to the roster and what is at Penn State, both for the blue-white game, but just also in general. Obviously, some guys played more in that than others. Most of the guys who we're going to cover in this next segment did not play much, for a good reason, because there's a key question facing this Penn State team going into 2025 when you lose 2 first-round picks, 2 top 15 picks in Abdul Carter and Tyler Warren, and you have 5 guys drafted overall. 2 things I think are clear based on those facts. One is that you're losing 2 of your biggest game records, but also that the number of guys that Penn State typically has drafted compared to guys that came back tells you that a lot of the potential game records are still here. doing big things for Penn State in 2025. So this was inspired by a question that came up on, I believe you said it was Tuesday's BWI Live T, Frank. Is that right?
Yeah, somebody responded to us on the message board, and yesterday's show was about national media putting Penn State as the number one team heading into 2025 post portal, given that they've added and been so aggressive trying to address their needs at this point throughout the last 2 weeks or so. But PSU 123 wanted to point out, like, great, you're addressing your needs. Do you have superstars? Do you have talent-laden guys that will change the dynamic? And his point is, whether it's Michigan or Ohio State, those teams had guys that were top 10 picks, or guys that were superstars, guys that, as he called them, were game wreckers. And so he wanted to know, does Penn State have game wreckers on the level of a Mason Graham or a Jeremiah Smith and a Caleb Downs for those two teams? And I think it's a fair question. I think that's because we've been focusing on what are the weaknesses, what are the areas where Penn State needs to improve. But yeah, that top end of the roster, do they have guys that are superstars where you can build a team around those players and make them, have those players' best attributes shine at the highest levels at the biggest times against the biggest opponents? And I thought it was a good exercise to go through the roster and say, like, okay, who are the game records for Penn State on offense and defense? And I wanted to get your thoughts, because I responded on the message board and I put in way too many names, like way too many names on both sides of the ball. By definition, you can't have 7 game records, because the defense has to game plan, or the offense has to game plan for a handful of things. They're not game planning for every player on your roster. So do you want to start? Do you want me to start? How do you want to go through and kind of pick guys off the lineup you think are game wreckers in 2025?
Yeah, I mean, I think the obvious place to start is going to be in the backfield, right? I think that without question, teams are going to start their game planning focusing on, okay, there's no Tyler Warren. We know Drew Aller's a senior, and he's trying to figure out who his best options are in terms of the passing game. So what are you going to do? You're going to make him try and have to utilize those guys, whoever they might be, and take away Penn State's running backs, because if you don't, Nick Singleton might bust one for 80 yards and a touchdown, or Katron Allen might just 5, 6, 10, 12 yard you to death right down the field. So
break 8 tackles.
That's the low-hanging fruit, obviously. I think that there's no question that as teams get into this portion of the offseason and really their analysts start the the opponent scouting process, and as these coaches are flying around during the contact period watching tape on the iPads, there's no doubt they're going to look and say, okay, what did Andy Kotelnicki do in year one that could be replicated, and what things did he maybe leave on the cutting room floor that could be put in for these guys under the direction of Stan Drayton as well, that could take Penn State's rushing attack to even a better level in 2025. So to me, the conversation starts there on offense. Obviously, you can say it starts with Drew Aller, and I would understand that. But to me, it starts with those two guys behind him, and it moves on from there.
Yeah, I want to start with the Penn State offensive line, because I think of the groups that have held up their end of the bargain, especially in the run game, consistently in 23 and 24, the Penn State offensive line, maybe they don't have superstars 1 through 5. And yes, they have Olu Fashanu. We think that Anthony Donko can be a superstar. He got hurt. We didn't kind of get to see a full season from him. But in the aggregate, that offensive line in the playoffs last year was dominant. Oregon was a really good run defense to that point in the season. Those defensive linemen, especially, Harmon going in the first round, 21 overall, like, he's that good. And Penn State was able to neutralize them. Sure, they don't have, I don't know that they have a top 5 pick like Olu Fashanu on the roster. But when you're consistent across the board, to me, that's a game wrecker where you can just pop off a clean run with an outside zone, getting Nick Singleton in space, and it's 22 yards, and he didn't even do anything other than find the right hole and run to the safety. That's what happened last year. The last 2 years, the whole conversation about this run game is where are the explosive plays. The offensive line is delivering them to the second level unblocked regularly over the last 2 years. So I agree with you. I think Nick Singleton and Katron Allen are going to be those guys this year. Understand Drayton, but the offensive line has been that for this offense. The problem has been in pass protection, and it's been better. But some of the stunts and twists that get this team have been also consistent. I think that's less of an issue, though, if you've got the full infrastructure in the passing game. I think two, kind of compounding issues there cause that to be a bigger problem than it would be in other offenses. And then, I think on the offense, Drew Aller, the question was kind of phrased of top 5 guys at their position. Drew Aller was a top 25 quarterback when he first started in 23. Last year, I'd say ballpark, he was top 15. Maybe a little high, like in the high teens. I don't have a problem projecting him to being a top 5 quarterback this year. That should be the expectation. So let me just say this. Like, we've been talking about Drew Aller developing and getting better time and time, right? The next step is for him to take that turn, for Singleton and Aller specifically to become first-round draft picks for next year. That does matter in, like, who cares about the NFL draft, win college football games? You win it with stars, and that's the point of this. I think those two guys on offense specifically have the talent to become first-round draft picks, and you got to see it this year. You have to see it from Drew Aller this year. And I've believed in him, the mental mind behind the quarterback, the processing, the ability to see everything and act on it. I expect him to be ultra consistent and make those plays this year. That's, as somebody who sees he can do it, now's the time he has to do it. So I'm projecting that into this, area of, as much as we're going to get into potential guys that could be this, guys that could develop into game wreckers, I'm just going to auto put him into that first round. So now, Greg, who are the guys you think that could develop into that this year? Some guys that weren't last year, but have the ability to be game wreckers. And let's do the offense first.
Yeah, so I think you look at this Penn State roster, and the easiest place to start is going to be, you can make whatever projections you want at wide receiver. Again, if you're coming into the show a little bit late, or if you skipped ahead on the replay, I said earlier I am the president, if not the vice president of the fan club that is saying I'm not buying anything on the, I am at the point James Franklin was about the offensive line a few years ago at Big Ten Media Days, where he refused to talk about them and said, I'm going to let them show it to you on the field. That's where I'm at with this group, even though it's some newcomers and guys that, fairly or not, you may be able to put more stock in than others. I just want to see it on the field. And obviously how Drew Aller plays and how the pass protection is all plays a role in that. But I'm not willing to. I could pick some receivers. I'm just not going to. So where does that lead me to? It leads me to the tight end room, where obviously Tyler Warren, the game wrecker of all game wreckers, has moved on and is going to start his NFL career in Indianapolis. So, I was thinking about this position group yesterday, doing some more post-spring stuff over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, and I feel like there's a couple thoughts I have about that group and as it relates to this conversation. The first is, it's not going to surprise me if Andrew Rappleyea surprises some people this year coming back off the injury. Now, I'm not calling him a game wrecker, and I'm not even saying he's a potential game wrecker at this second in time. I want to wait till he gets back to preseason camp and it's good to go after missing so much time with the injury. But I think that's one thought on the tight ends I have. The second is that what is Luke Reynolds going to do for an encore? I thought he was a guy that, they went in the last season. Everyone seems to want to forget, or, maybe they just don't think it matters. I don't know where you fall on this. But this was a guy that was going to redshirt, and then he had to play at West Virginia because Khalil Dinkins was banged up. And then once Andrew Rappleyea went down, he may have still been in that green category or on the green-yellow divide, if you will. But I think that, he was a guy that they thought was going to come along maybe more so with work off the field than on it. Turns out he had to play a good bit, played pretty well. So I think you have to put him in that category. And obviously, Khalil Dinkins may be the most slept-on tight end in America by the time we get to the middle portion of the season. Look, he's a guy to me, T. Frank, that he is either going to shoot onto the midseason All-American first or second teams, or I am going to be just wrong about what I think he can do with a number of, I don't really see any middle ground, I guess.
Yeah.
If Drew Aller called him the best blocking tight end in America, or one of the best blocking tight ends in America, and we saw that at times last year. And if he pairs that with increased pass game production because he is no longer stuck behind Tyler Warren, I think that he is going to quickly make a name for himself nationally. So if not, he can still be very productive for Penn State in this offense, just maybe not to the level that I think he can reach based on what I've seen and heard about him over the last few years.
It's interesting because in 2023, they basically used him as a wide receiver to end the season after firing Mike Yurcich and putting him at X. And that told me, after watching him run routes and watching him run, like, this dude's uber athletic. And then I don't know what happened. Maybe he was banged up last spring. He didn't run particularly great. And so that kind of painted a picture of a guy that maybe wasn't as athletic as I was expecting. And then his blocking kind of reinforced that idea of, this is a guy who, you watch him on film, and I've mentioned this before, he was doing more of the dirty work because you're using Tyler Warren as the chess piece to move around the offense, get him in matchups. So you're not going to just plunk him next to the right or left tackle and have him bang heads with defensive ends. So that became Khalil Dinkins' job. Well, he did a really good job of that. And he's fast. He's pretty explosive. So, I think he ran much better this year. That is a complete tight end. A guy that we saw who has the route running chops, a kind of a different moving skill. Maybe he's not 258 or 260 like Tyler Warren, but he's close to 250. He's a thick guy. Like, watching him in spring this year, he definitely looks like a full blood tight end at this point. So I'm more and more on the line of, this is tight end number one, and Luke Reynolds can be great, but Khalil Dinkins is tight end one, and there's not really a question about that. And that's where Reynolds is going to have an uphill battle, but he's obviously as talented, if not more talented, from a physical perspective, but he's got to put it all together as a second-year player. So I agree. Those are the two guys that I had in terms of potential game wreckers. Somebody wanted to know 2025 freshmen that could have an impact. I don't see any, like, in this conversation. There's no Jeremiah Smith. Physically, Matt Otten can do it
out there. I think we all forget that there are a few of those guys out there.
Yeah. But here's the thing, like, I'm not saying that he's Jeremiah Smith, but Matt Otten is explosively fast, and he's 212 pounds as a freshman. So physically, he looks different. He looks more like a running back, and I know that's where all the comparisons to Deebo Samuel are coming from. But, I don't think he's a guy that can physically do that. And then Kobe Howard is in a situation where they just brought in a guy that plays his position. So I don't know that there's really a path to the field for those receivers. And then outside of that, like, it's not going to be a tight end. It's not going to be a running back. It's not going to be an offensive lineman. So on offense, I don't see any 2025 players like contributing a lot. It's really down to Kobe Howard. And at that point, I'm kind of TBD about it.
Yeah, we have a ton of neat defensive names popping up in the chat. We're going to get there. We started on offense. Sorry. Yeah. We guess we should have spelled that out more. But I think there's I actually have one final offense thought, and then I see a comment in the chat that's a good transition from offense to defense. But this is not necessarily a game record conversation, but I really, really, in short yardage situations, want to see Vanga Iwani be a defensive line wrecker from his stance and not in motion. That's what I want to see in 2025. Sorry, I couldn't help but think of that as we were going through this conversation. I don't need to see any more of that. I know it works from time to time.
It's happening.
Yeah, well, get ready for me to be salty then in the fall, because I just think that it looks great. I don't know. Andy Kotelnicki knows more about football and has forgotten more about football than obviously I ever will. But sometimes I look at that and just wonder what Penn State's losing within not being down in the trenches in those short yardage situations. But that's a conversation for another day.
Yeah, but I also think I want to put a specific offensive lineman on that kind of game wrecker, and I would love to say Venga is that guy who is going to be a game wrecker, but I haven't seen consistent physical dominance from him on film. Flashes here and there, but you would expect a guy who's 240 pounds or 340 pounds to be mauling dudes and laying people out on their back. The explosiveness, I think, is part of the conversation there. And that's where I want to mention, Donko is the obvious guy coming off injury. There's a caveat there. Javen Williams is a 5-star. Like, there's a reason he was a 5-star offensive lineman. I don't know if it's a superstar turn for him or Cooper Cousins this year, but I'm not ruling it out because both those guys have the physical tools to be the complete offensive lineman. And I think it's super exciting that Penn State, one of those guys is starting. One of those guys is going to be like a key reserve player. And, that's the offensive line as a whole, no doubt. Those two individuals, I think, have the chance to eventually be that guy for the offense.
All right, well, let's move this conversation over to the defense. I had a different comment from the chat in mind to do this, but Patrick just comes in and saves the day right at the end here. Says, give the ball to Zane Durant in short yardage or line him up at fullback.
Yes!
I would enjoy that immensely, actually. I would have no problem with that. But yeah,
he played
obviously
halfback in high school.
Yep,
like, it's not
sure
that
did.
crazy. He played running back in high school.
If Tyler Warren could play quarterback in high school and use that skill for Penn State, why can't Zane Durant do it as a ball carrier? I like the thought for May 7th, no question about it. But anyway, moving over to the defense in this conversation about potential game wreckers for Penn State defensively, I don't know if there's any, there's a number of guys you could probably make a case for in terms of where to start debating here. But to me, Zane Durant had a much better than people give him credit for season in 2024. I know that the stat, that's one of those things where he is the, what's the word I'm looking for here? Carbon. No, that's not it. The prototype, I guess you could say, for guys who, if you had time to watch every single college football game, he would have been on more postseason award teams and things like that than he ultimately ended up being, because a lot of those, unfortunately, even for the coaches' votes, come down to stats, and he is not, at least last year, wasn't a stat collector, but guess what? Yeah. He made sure a lot of other Penn State players collected stats, and we'll see what he can do in Jim Knowles' defense this year. But to me, he has all the makings. I know he's not maybe the biggest guy in terms of some defensive tackles, but he can do some things that bigger defensive tackles cannot do at the size and speed he plays at. So to me, he is 1A, deny Dennis Sutton 1B in this conversation, and 1A. You can interchange him, you can make him any way you want. Those two guys for Penn State to be its best on defense, in my mind, have to lead the way up front.
Absolutely. And I think specifically for a guy like Zane, he's actually better against the run. 27 stops last year, according to PFF. I just pulled that up. That's a great number for a defensive tackle. I don't know where that ranks. I apologize. I'll get that here in a second. But where he needs to take that turn is as an interior pocket pusher. And I agree. He's the guy that I circled number one as the game wrecker for the guys up front. But it has to be against the pass as well. And he was better this past year. He definitely improved. But there are certain things that are really important when it comes to pass rush specifically that you can't. It's harder to be successful if you don't have them. And length is just the number one thing I look for. I don't care if you're 6'1". I care if you have 31-inch arms. And I know wingspan is different than reach, but reach is the one that we have generally more data on overall. Everyone gets reach over full frame wingspan. And Durant does not have that massive wingspan to overcome his height. And it's shown up like in his sack totals, where he's gotten 7 career sacks despite being an excellent run defender and an excellent football player since his freshman season. I don't love sacks as a total of output, but it is indicative when you don't have a lot of them. And, he was much better with getting pressures last year. It's just converting those into dominating wins, being a game wrecker, where that's what we're talking about here. The threshold is now not being a really good pass rusher, but I have to scheme against Zane Durant. And I think he can be that, kind of in the Drew Aller conversation. I'm just putting him there. I'm not going to say, well, maybe we have to see it first. Like, he's shown progress. He's a good enough player, and he's so talented in every other way that I don't care. I'm just going to put him in that conversation. And then to me, that's where it cuts off. And I'm going to be talking on both sides of my mouth, because deny Dennis Sutton, I don't have as a game record just yet. I think he's a guy that does have to prove to me he can be the number one edge rusher on this team, because he's had the physical ability this whole time, but there have been other guys that have leapfrogged him in that conversation, because what he lacks is that elite bend. And this is not me saying anything that he hasn't already said, working on his pad level, making sure that he's keeping his leverage correct. And he's a really good football player. He uses his hands well. But I would love to see that, because that's the difference maker between a really good D end and a guy who is a top 5 player. And so from a work ethic standpoint, I believe he can get there, but sometimes you are just tall, and that's that. And so I'm curious what you think, if you've got him on that list, and then, if not, or if you do, then why?
Yeah, I do. And I think that, well, it's an interesting conversation because are we projecting guys to be, or is it having the potential to be, or have they proven it yet? And I think he's proven it in some respects. But no, I agree with you to an extent that there are some things he will have to do going into this season to not only, show you're right, show he can be the guy, not the guy who was playing across from Abdul Carter.
And there's a higher threshold at edge, right. I think, too.
Right.
That's my thing, too.
Fair, too.
There's a much higher threshold for game wrecker at edge as opposed to, other positions.
Right. I think that there's no doubt in my mind that an Dennis Sutton can have an Abdul Carter or a Chop Robinson-like season. But I agree that, edge, to be in that game-wrecking edge conversation nationally, not just for your team or not just for your conference, it's a high bar to clear. There's no doubt. And I think that it's almost like that, like this defense as a whole with Jim Knowles at the helm. Like one name I was about to bring up just popped up in the chat, but A.J. Harris is one. Zachy Wheatley is one.
There's a lot of guys that are on the potential list for sure.
Absolutely. Like the defense that with what Penn State loses on defense, it may not look like a ton. But you had guys who played a lot of snaps who are now moving on. You also return a lot of guys who played a lot of snaps. And so, A.J. Harris to me is a guy that's right at the top of that potential game record list. Zachy Wheatley obviously is there. Elliott Washington is there. Again, depending on, you might have tiers of these things, but
can I give you my guy? I'm chomping at the bit now. Tony Rojas, in terms of complete skill set. So this is the thing. It's physical, it's mental, it's all of it. It's not just so Zachy Wheatley, I think, is going to be the guy that gets all the stats in this defense because he's smart. He's a senior. He's shown that he's more durable and physical in the box. But when we talk about elite traits, I think he's a little shy of that. Now he can get better, but as a senior, like how much better is he going to get? Tony Rojas played through a shoulder injury that would have put most of us in the hospital for a while and still was a great coverage player last year and struggled against the run. There's no question about that. If he's healthy, this dude has everything. You saw, he's got like 4.37 speed is what I think came out the other day. He put it on social media at 238 pounds. Wow. Wow. And it shows up in games. It shows up in games as the things. Like, he's not just track fast. He's the guy that returned that pick six. Those things, when fully healthy, he is going to be an explosive force in the run game. And I understand that, again, I'm projecting this year that he is a better tackler than we saw last year. And I can be wrong. That's absolutely right. There were some signs that he liked to throw shoulders and he wanted the highlights, in that first game against West Virginia. But I also saw the year before where he wasn't doing that and he wasn't trying to make a statement and he was just tackling people and it was great. Tony Rojas and A.J. Harris to me are the two guys that have that like first round draft pick potential. All of the traits all rolled together.
And I think that it's a fun conversation to continue to have this offseason as we learn more about how these guys come out of spring ball and what they do in preseason camp. Because, I think for sure, more so than the offense where there's a lot more of I would say known, a lot of known situations. Obviously, tight end one, not the case. But by and large, I feel like you have fewer players on the list of potential, and because you elevate more of them to game record status. And defense, you have more guys who are on the cusp. You just have to wait and see who they are. So we'll continue having that conversation throughout the offseason. But as we come down the home stretch here, I want to make sure we get to the Sunday film study, which you can always read these from T. Frank over at BWIillustrated.com. It's just $1 to sign up for the first week. Build annually from there. So join us. I know that the transfer portal windows are closed, but as we get into May, recruiting is really going to heat up and then just go crazy in June. So you want to be over there for the latest recruiting intel and insight, plus any team news that comes up. And obviously a lot more is being covered at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, where it's $1 for the first week and then build annually from there. So join us at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. T. Frank, the Sunday film study, as we mentioned at the top of the show, for any of you joining us live and late, we brought this up before the Campbell talk and the transfer portal talk, but we're still going through some blue-white review and look back and things of that nature. Penn State, of course, wrapped up spring ball about 2 weeks ago now, a week and a half ago, whatever it may be. But you took a good look at the defense while you were at Beaver Stadium on April 26th. It was a crazy day, man. The blue-white game, the NFL draft, there was some wrestling stuff going on. I'm just thinking back on that day was nuts.
I had my nephew on his phone sitting behind me, and he was like, the Bills just traded up. And I'm like,
Not now.
Why can't I be in two places at once? Why can't I clone myself and be in two places at once? That was the worst.
Yes. It was a fun day, though. We learned a lot. So let's just, I don't know, you do the lead off here. Where do you want to start the bidding on this conversation as we look back on the blue-white game?
With that conversation about linebackers and safeties and playmakers on defense, because one of the things I was looking for this in the game, because it's something that I was curious about of how they would build this defense, what they would blend, what was previously here with what they wanted to do with what Jim Knowles was bringing in. And Zakee Wheatley is going to be the star of this defense in terms of they're going to scheme plays for him to get to the ball carrier unblocked. That's kind of how this defense works, where that's the thing is Tony Rojas might not have an impact season from tackles for loss or explosive plays the way they would have for Manny Diaz or Tom Allen, because there is much more of the front seven and front six really is about taking away gaps and letting guys run to the football unblocked. Those guys typically are the field safety in the nickel corner, which is why King Mack is so important. And I don't want to take Zion Tracy out of this completely, but the skill set of King Mack is really important because he's a physical downhill thumper. That's a guy that can tackle really well despite his size, and he's really fast. Zion Tracy can be that guy. He's fast, he's smart, he just needs to prove that he can tackle. And then Zakee Wheatley is kind of the ace of this, where there are certain plays in Jim Knowles' defense. You saw Caleb Downs do this, bringing this back to our previous conversation, where they basically use him as the Mike linebacker. So these linebackers expand out a little bit, and then the safety is the middle guy in the middle, like an old school middle linebacker lined up over the center, except he's lined up 10 yards down the field. And the beauty of that is the offense does not include him in the run fits. And so he can just appear anywhere as long as the defense doesn't get it wrong. And he's, then chasing something with a free gap somewhere where it's something bad happened. But, that's what we saw. That's why I saw those. One of the first things I saw in the blue-white game is that's what they're going to do. Not all the time. It's not 100% of the defense. They're not doing that every single play, but they worked on it in front of us, publicly. And so I think that's a big thing for this defense, for the understanding of it, and for the nature of how these the changes in expectation you might have. Now, linebackers still got to absorb a lot of tackles in this defense. They just might not be those tackles for loss, and the safeties might be getting more of those. And then on offense, they were not shy about doing a bunch of different stuff. Somebody asked in the chat, is Penn State gonna, he'd love to see, I don't want to say it was a wing T offense. That's why I'm looking this up. Yeah, Chris W says, I'd love to see a flex wing offense. I don't know what flex wing offense is. I think you mean a wing T offense. I could be wrong. Apologize. A lot of times names mean different things, and they mean the same thing, but I'm not familiar with that one in particular. With a lot of play action this season, we have the backs and a couple of receivers who could blow the game wide open. I think Penn State kind of agrees with you. I didn't want to say anything. I talked about it on the Blue White Illustrated message board, but I didn't want to do anything until they did it publicly in at the blue-white game where anyone could walk in for free. They're going under center. They're playing play action. They're doing hard play fakes. A lot of these things that are, a pocket passer, an NFL quarterback like Drew Aller, and I mean NFL in terms of his style of being a good athlete but not being a athletic quarterback. They're doing those in this offense this year. How much they do, when they do it, that's all the mystery of it. But they're going under center. So Penn State fans, be very excited. You're going to see Nick Singleton in a single eye formation. That was me cheering silently for those people on the podcast. So that's happening. That's something that they showed in front of us. And then other things like play actions and wildcats and all kinds of different formations, things that we saw last year, it's all coming back. And they're going to build upon those things. So those are my biggest observations from what did I pick up watching it live? I think those are some interesting wrinkles on the offensive side and the defensive side that are at least building blocks of what they worked on early in spring.
Penn State has a lot of work still to do, of course, between now and preseason camp, and we'll be covering that all here on the Blue White Illustrated YouTube page. Also, your podcast feeds and at bluewhiteillustrated.com. We can hit on this here before we get rolling on out of here, I guess. JC asked, any thoughts on Heather Dinich's interview with Jim Knowles? This was written over at ESPN. Very well-written, reported story on Tuesday. Yeah, there was a comment earlier in the chat too. So one of the things that came out of that story was related to Drew Aller getting some feedback from Jim Knowles about, his deep ball and maybe some things he could change with that. Again, that was part of the conversations we had with Andy Kolnicki earlier this spring. It filters down to the players in that, those guys had a book on Penn here. Jim Knowles and the analyst he brought with him had a book on Penn State, of course. And, of course, Penn State had a book on Jim Knowles. And so that's a two-way street. Obviously, with what Jim Knowles' defense did to Penn State.
Book
probably
wasn't
more
as useful the other way around.
Yeah, right. Yeah, more for Penn State to learn from him than vice versa. But, yeah, it was a good story. I'd recommend you check it out if you haven't. Certainly a lot of good info in there. And he made it clear, T. Frank, that if they would have given him a contract extension before the college football playoff title game, Penn State would have somebody else calling its defense this spring and this fall.
And I thought it was interesting, one of the comments about basically the way they treated the situation, including when he started talking to other teams and they asked him not to come to the parade. That kind of sealed the deal, where they were their own worst enemy in a lot of different ways in that situation. And I don't know, maybe that's what they were trying to go for, Greg. Maybe because there was the conflict and the tension within that coaching staff. Now that I've seen it from 22 through 24, it's obvious of what he wanted to do, what he wasn't allowed to do, and then what he iterated to with that I just explained with Zakee Wheatley. That's all part of the story at Ohio State. So what came out of that, and that's one of the reasons I'm very high on Jim Knowles, is when you put him in a box and you tell him you can't do something because you don't have an athlete, or I just won't let you do that, he's going to find a way to innovate. And he found a way to innovate with Caleb Downs in a way that was, I think, different and really impressive. So I really liked that. And it was interesting to kind of get the context behind all of that.
It certainly was. So definitely check that out if you haven't yet. T. Frank, any final thoughts as we head on out of here on a Wednesday morning?
So many film studies. I got to do 3 linebacker studies. So that's what I'm going to be doing. Plus, we're putting in a garden. So I got to find some time to go out and rototill and put down some soil and plant some plants. So lot to do for a Wednesday in May. There's never any job is hard if you try and make it as hard as possible. Even one as fun as ours.
Yes, there's no question about that. Well, we know you all have a lot going on, so we appreciate you taking some time out of your day to spend it with us. That's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickle. BWI Live is back on May 8th with the recruiting show with Sean Fitz and Ryan Snyder. Until then, we will talk to you next time wherever you get your podcast. They're right here on the YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us.